Make up mine. Fight.
Team Fortress 2 is a very mechanically rich game. When you've got 9 classes using any combination of over 100 unlockable weapons over a patch period of roughly 20 years, you're bound to run into some very interesting mechanics and funny mechanical interactions. That said, not every stat in TF2 is created equal. For every heal 300 health on use or on hit gain 25% uber charge, there are a wide variety of stats and mechanics across TF2's weapons that simply don't work as described. What, do you expect the stat descriptions Valve wrote down specifically to teach you how to play the game to be accurate? What are you, fucking stupid? In this video, I want to talk about some of these exceptions to TF2's typical functionality. I want to know, I am aware that Great Blue made 2 videos with similar concepts to these a few years ago, and while I do enjoy both of those videos, I want to take a bit of a different approach here. Great Blue's videos discuss weapon stats that were functionally unlikely to matter in the course of an actual match, your 10% slower swing speeds and all that, or your straight up missing stats like on the Huntsman or Shortstop. I want to instead talk about weapons that either straight up don't work or are otherwise obsoleted by the game's other mechanics. Rather than pointless stats, we're talking about straight up invalid stats. That said, let's roll. Starting us off is a weapon that I'm piss scared to talk about on this channel because every time that I do, someone finds a reason to get angry at me for it. But to open this video, let's talk about the Force of Nature. This is an extremely fun weapon that's defined by its focus on mobility and displacement over straight up killing power, with its knockback being the core ability that allows Scout to throw off enemies and put himself in an advantageous position. To accentuate this, the weapon is intended to deal 10% less damage than the stock scattergun to enemies, which makes sense as you probably don't want the weapon that can instantly displace any enemy and grant Scout even more mobility to straight up one-shot any given class. That said, due to another stat that this weapon shares, it actually doesn't work that way in practice. In addition to its 10% damage penalty, the Force of Nature also features 20% more pellets per shot, which means that at point-blank range, a meat shot with the Force of Nature ends up dealing slightly more damage than the scattergun. Now, in practice, this doesn't result in a higher damage over time, as the Force of Nature's smaller clip size and lower reload does mean that it ends up with a lower overall DPS output, but the intended stat of it dealing 10% less damage per shot is certifiably incorrect if you're able to connect a good number of pellets. Even from medium to longer ranges, the higher number of pellets can result in more connecting and outputting more damage at that range than the scattergun. So while its overall DPS is lower, its actual per shot damage penalty does not function as intended. I sure hope the Force of Nature cultists don't find a reason to yell at me for this section.
I'm going to blast you into thin gruel.
Next up, let's talk about the Loose Cannon. This is, again, a very fun weapon that moves the goalpost of its class from straight up killing power to displacement and disruption. I love the Loose Cannon. I think it's a shining example of a fun out of 10 weapon in TF2, one that doesn't need to be meta or game defining because it's just so fun to use, but this weapon is also noteworthy for not exactly working the way it's intended to. I've previously described this weapon as misleading, and that's mainly due to its very funny cannonball model. This weapon's projectile model causes so many problems to the weapon that it makes you wonder why it doesn't just cut ties with it like a problematic Discord friend. For starters, its actual projectile hitbox is shared in the stock grenade launcher, meaning that the actual area to hit enemies of the cannonball is much smaller than the model size would lead you to believe. And more importantly, this weapon's proudly displayed 20% faster projectile speed is just straight up incorrect. Due to TF2's projectile physics and air drag mechanics, the cannonball model's size and bulk causes it to experience significantly more drag and air resistance while flying, resulting in a noticeably slower projectile speed than the stock grenade launcher. The 20% faster projectile speed is actually there as a means to articulate them covering for this, but it is still slower in practice than the stock grenade launcher. This is like a straight up failing on a stat conveyance level, as the actual mechanical function of the weapon is exactly the opposite of what the listed stat implies. I don't know why the Source Engine even factors air drag into its projectiles. Like, this video game world doesn't have actual oxygen that the characters need to breathe, but at the very least, you can say that it's realistic in a game where people can rocket jump. I also talked about both of these weapons in my knockback weapons video, which is a funny coincidence.
My fists, they are made of steel!
Next up, the Fists of Steel. In typical TF2 winner-stay-winning fashion, this popular meta heavy weapon has some pretty significant mechanical oversights that causes both of its primary negatives to not function properly. This weapon is obviously intended to be a face-tanking weapon that aids in Heavy's projectile soaking capabilities, while conversely being more committal to equip due to its slower holster speed and healing penalties. However, in practice, neither of these fucking work. For starters, any TF2 weapon with a holster speed penalty features features an exploit that allows the user to circumvent it by rapidly switching between your other weapons. For instance, have the Fist of Steel out, quickly switch to your sandwich, and then switch over to your minigun. The act of doing this is faster than letting the full holster speed penalty of the Fist of Steel complete. This goes for every weapon in TF2 with a holster speed penalty. The game's generous weapon switch speed allows you to mitigate anything that holsters slower. In addition, this weapon's overheal penalty only applies if the heavy had the Fist of Steel out when the medic started healing him, meaning that having any other weapon active and then switching to the Fist of Steel completely negate the overheal penalty. With some very simple communication or conveyance to your medic, you can adeptly capitalize on this and 100% ignore this weapon's only negatives. So yeah, if you ever find yourself being annoyed by the Fist of Steel's restrictive negatives, just remember that half of them do not work. You still get murked by melee attacks though.
Another satisfied customer.
Next up is another popular meta melee weapon with stats that are directly counteracted by another one, being the Jag. This is the engineer wrench, even after multiple rounds of attempted nerfs by Valve. I feel like they didn't really realize what they were doing in giving this thing a faster swing speed, as engineer has more to gain from swinging his melee weapon faster than any other class. It allows him to attack, upgrade, repair, and build significantly faster, and is all around the thing that enables the offensive level 3 engineer playstyle. That said, Valve did attempt to give this weapon a few concrete downsides in a lower damage, a lower building damage, which results in one extra swing needed to destroy sappers, and a lower repair speed. Seems pretty damning, however, this weapon's faster swing speed tends to pretty comfortably counteract all of them. While it is true these negatives do function properly, the faster swing speed on the Jag pretty comfortably counteracts them, either significantly cutting their threat level to straight up mitigating them. The nerfed repair rate specifically is especially counteracted by this, as the faster swing speed of the Jag results in more swings connecting and more repairing being doled out faster, which makes it so that its overall repair rate isn't too much lower than the stock wrench. The time it takes to do pretty much anything with the Jag isn't too far off the stock wrench even with these downsides, just because of the swing speed. This is one of those sleeper stats where its true nature isn't fully understood until you've used it for yourself. Engineer has so much to gain from attacking with his melee weapon faster, and any stat that attempts to counterbalance it will at least be partially mitigated. There's a reason that attack speed is such a valuable upgrade in MBM.
Piss off, you mongrels!
As our second to last weapon in this video, I want to discuss perennial teal opal favorite, the Sydney Sleeper. This is a pretty notoriously not good weapon, yet one that I cannot get enough of either way. It is true that debuffing enemies on sniper shot rather than straight up killing them is almost entirely useless, and just extends the amount of time it takes for a sniper round to kill them, but also it can still one-shot light classes, and it's still great for inducing psychological damage on your enemies. That said, geez, I've said that a lot in this video, one thing that I will wholeheartedly agree with is useless on this weapon is its Girardi interaction. Getting a headshot with the Sydney Sleeper will slightly fill up the sniper's bladder, reducing your Girardi cooldown by an astronomical 1 second. When you combine this with Girardi's 20-second cooldown timer, this means that it would take 20 shots or just under the Sydney Sleeper's entire ammo reserve to completely refill your Girardi. Lastly, the Sydney Sleeper was originally in an item set with a Darwin's Danger Shield and not the Girardi, so this stat just kind of seems like putting a square peg into a round hole to begin with. So yeah, while this stat does technically function as intended, it's remarkably useless and arbitrary in practice, and really only exists to add more blue text to this woefully disliked weapon's description. Not every P weapon needs to interact with each other.
I can see my base from here!
And lastly, to loop back to Scout, because I was originally going to talk about the Spycicle here before I realized that they removed its useless silent killer mechanic 9 years ago, I want to talk about the Atomizer. This weapon received a very funny yet very meaningless buff back in Jungle Inferno to always mini-crit when the Scout is airborne. While this might make you think that you can take on the role of a market gardening bird scout, I wouldn't be so hasty, as a mini-crit with the Atomizer does exactly 10 more damage for a total of 40. While that one-time 10 damage boost might make a significant difference in a fringe situation, it's worth noting that, due to the Atomizer's baked-in damage penalty, an airborne mini-crit with it will only do a whopping 5 more damage than a swing with the default bat. And when you consider that you'll likely only be landing 1 or 2 guaranteed mini-crits before hitting the ground with the Atomizer, and that the stock bat deals unconditional 35 damage at a base, you'll consistently be dealing more damage over that time by just swinging at enemies with the stock bat, rather than going for fringe Atomizer mini-crits. This assumes you even want to hit enemies with the Atomizer to begin with, which from my experience is generally used as either an escape or mobility tool and not a damage dealer. You could just shoot enemies with your 100+ damage shotgun as well, so while this stat was added in good faith, it is still very useless in practice. At least you can still be a piranha with it though. What are you, fucking stupid? And there we have it, some TF2 weapons with almost completely invalid, useless stats. Again, I tried hard to make this video different and interesting compared to Great Blues. TF2 has a surprisingly large lineup of weapons that don't work either as listed or as intended, so I hope you were either educated or entertained by this video at some point. Either way, thanks, hope you enjoyed, hope you have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch you all later. Cheers!